Hey everybody, this is Perch. And this video is kind of, in a weird way, it sums up a lot of other videos and other conversations that we've had around comics, around the sales, around if things are doing great or doing poorly or what have you. Um, the challenge is, and I've said this before, depending on how you frame the argument, you can almost prove any case you want to frame. But there's a couple just truths out there that surpass kind of everything, foundational things. So, in particular, there's like a moment in time that a lot of people gravitate to, and it's the 90s. So, why the 90s? Why is the 90s such a barometer for if the comic industry is healthy or not healthy? Well, the 90s had two things going for it, or two things that happened, I guess, during the 90s, in particular, kind of the early to mid 90s. Number one, the newsstand started to fade away. The direct market rose, and there was less emphasis placed on the newsstand. Now, some of that, as you heard my other video, I'm sure on it, some of that was that the comic publishers themselves started to walk away from the newsstand, and some of it was that retail, the newsstand itself, started to change. And what I mean by that is that, gas stations went to pay at the pump. Grocery stores started to emphasize kind of just get in, get out, and kind of de-emphasize magazines and other things. You had Borders and you had Barnes and Noble through the 90s, but those also started to suffer as we got to the end of that decade. So it's the retail business was shifting, and also the comic publishers walked away from the newsstand in favor of the direct market. And I gave reasons for that in another video that you can go check out. But that's one big thing. The other thing, though, that happened in the 90s was this giant speculator boom, and then, of course, bust. And this was people who believed that they would be able to send their kids to college via comics, that, huge price increases. Comics is like kind of for lack of a better word, the poor man's stock market. You could buy in, you could see a cash value. There were a bunch of very sensationalistic stories about people who owned Superman #1 being millionaires, or the death of Robin comics skyrocketing in value, and you could make easy money. And some people definitely did make money, but more people made nothing. They bought into kind of the speculator boom. Image came out and were hyping a bunch of different things. You had variant covers and all that kind of stuff. So all of this, the two factors combined to do this interesting thing in the 90s where the comic business seemed to soar. We had that $8 to $9 million sales, or not dollar, unit sales of X-Men #1. We had huge sales for X-Force. It's why so many of the comics that are in the top 10 of all time, and again, there is also another video on this, came out of the 90s. There was a lot of things that came together. Kind of the speculator market and kind of the rise of the direct market, different ways, price increases, all of these pieces. However, if you look at comics from that period to today, what you see is by and large a decline of what is traditionally known as the US or Western comic market. Now, if you're looking at numbers and you're seeing that the numbers are going up, that's true. But as we've already covered again elsewhere, and many other people as well, that's being supplemented by manga, by YA, by Scholastic, by other things. If you're looking at just the traditional Marvel, DC, Image, some indies, superhero comic books from the West, it has been in more or less a decline since the 90s. The biggest driver of that is the loss of the newsstand, bar none. The other thing that was a loss of it is that the collectors and people who were speculators in the 90s, which drove it up, also vanished. If you took what I would call a true sales metric of the 80s, where there was the newsstand, but there was also returnability. And if you took out the returnability and you just took the comics sold through, the comics that the publishers did not have to rebate or refund, then you would still see a decline from the 80s, no doubt about it. But that's to be expected because, once again, the newsstand had comics being sold in a lot more places. But that decline would not be as steep if you took out the 90s, because the 90s pushed everything up because of the before mentioned reasons. So that's kind of the truth of just what went on during that time period. Now, you might be saying, well, there's one other big factor that a lot of people talk about that you're not mentioning, you're avoiding, which is the content inside of comics that, maybe artists declined or writers declined or, all the different kind of quality of hiring, some various social topics and other things that go on in comics. What about that? The problem is, and I'm just speaking honestly here to you, is that it's very hard to quantify exactly how much that's impacted things. Because, when you have a comic like, you have Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman on Venom, which is pretty much as classic of a superhero kind of comic team you could think of. I mean, that would fit right in with the 90s in terms of kind of storytelling and sensibilities there. But you've got that next to, Children of the Atom, or you've got it next to some of the other books that are going on where they're, replacing legacy heroes and kind of all that kind of stuff. And you're left with a lot of question marks of, well, how can we kind of tell if things are declining or not declining based on that reason? I would argue this, and just work with me here. The decline from the 90s is based really around distribution and metrics and price increases and a lot of very kind of, raw things that are not subjective, things that have nothing to do actually with the quality of the comic or the artist, the writer team, etc. However, and it's a big however, it's a capital, all caps, however, um, I would argue that those factors, kind of the creative talents on the book, some of the people getting hired, some of the decompressed storytelling, the things that kind of you could point to and say this is a lack of quality in comics. I would argue that those things, the things that impacts that, is less loss than growth. And now you may be going, oh my God, he's splitting hairs. What does this even mean? Loss is growth, everything. No, because here's my question for you. Are comics mass market, mass appeal? What do I mean by that? I mean that if you're putting out, say, Spider-Man, is Spider-Man appealing to the most possible people, the largest possible audience, people who are all different, different ages, different races, different genders, different interests, different, all that kind of stuff? Is Spider-Man casting as wide a net as possible to bring in new readers, to bring in readers? If you look at comics during the 80s, they were certainly superhero comics, but they were also fairly, I would say, benign in the sense that they were built to kind of be homogenous. They were built to appeal to a lot of different people. Definitely there was a gate there that you had to be kind of interested in superheroes, but it was shooting for as wide an audience as possible. One of these kind of weird memory hold kind of arguments I think people have is that they point to the X-Men and they'll say, the X-Men appealed to a niche audience back in the 80s. But I think nothing could be farther from the truth. The X-Men was a classic superhero book. It featured a very diverse group of characters. It had all of kind of the elements to be as mass market of a comic as possible. Same thing with Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, etc. Comics like Sandman, Doom Patrol. I mean, comics I loved, by the way, loved Doom Patrol. I loved Shade the Changing Man. Absolutely love it. But I would be absolutely lying to myself and all of you if I said that was a mass market comic book. It wasn't. That comic book was aimed at a very particular segment. It was a genre book, and that was how it was billed, marketed, and produced. It was produced to appeal to a relatively small group. Small is maybe the wrong word. Focused. It was designed to appeal to a very focused group. It was not trying to get as many people as possible to read that comic book. It was trying to really speak to the audience it was going after. And there's nothing wrong with that. But here's the question to ask yourself, no matter where you fit on this cultural divide or anything else, are the comics being produced today mass market comics? Or are they really kind of appealing to a very limited audience, a very niche audience? I would argue the latter. I would argue that a lot of comic books are really very specific in the audience they're going after and what they're trying to do. And I think it's as a result, it casts a smaller net. It's not the comic industry today is built and operating in a way that is not really designed for a lot of growth. It's designed for for appealing to the audience it has. or maybe appealing to the audience it wants. The X-Men comics today are, very specific. They're very dense in some areas. There's definitely more of a focus at Marvel for, more. I don't know what was a word. I mean, what do you call a genre where people are eating dinner in the comics all the time? Like what is that? What is that genre? I'm not sure, but it is a smaller, more niche audience that they're going after than kind of the X-Men of before. It's just a different product. And if the comic industry is happy with this niche audience, if they're happy with the group that they've got, then I guess no problem for them. They're happy. But this isn't a hyper growth model. If you're doing business planning, you would not look at the comics that are being produced today and say, aha, these are going out to as wide a group as possible. Now let me address one other elephant in the room, because this is something people often bring up. Many comics today are touching on LGBTQ issues, and that's a lightning rod for a lot of people. People are saying, well, if you do that, then you're cutting away from your audience. And other people are saying, well, you don't want the audience that would be against that. And it just gets into a big convoluted argument. It's a bit of a red herring argument, in my opinion. I think you can have certainly LGBTQ content. Again, The Authority was a very popular comic book. Yes, in part by the writer and the artist team, but it featured a very prominent gay couple. It did not have problem in sales. It did not have problems reaching a mass audience. The challenge The Authority had was that it often was too violent to appeal to some of the audience it wanted. It lost the kids in that market. That was the thing that it was ignoring, and the thing that was letting go. It was not, turning away, quote unquote straight cis readers. They were reading it just fine and being fine with it. It's not if you feature gay characters or not. That's not really the point. Is the story itself, is the art style as mass market as possible? Is the writing as mass market as possible? Is the price point as mass market as profitable? That's the current hiccup. That's where I think comics right now are limiting their audience. I'm saying that in the most positive way. I think that's where, if I was kind of running the business and looking at this, that's where I would be focused, is how do we get the comic to appeal to a wider audience so we can sell more copies. And, to be clear, by the way, if you say that in the world of movies or music, I mean, no, not lots, but I know a handful of independent filmmakers, and they would be horrified if you told them, hey, you should try and make your movie more like a Michael Bay movie so it could appeal to more people. They would quickly tell you, I'm not trying to appeal to more people. I'm trying to tell the story I want to tell. I'm trying to make a product that I can be proud of, not appeal to a bunch of, millions of people who live in the Midwest. And again, that's fine. That's your choice, but it is a limiting choice. And so I think comics in general, they have been in a state of sales decline from the 90s. I think a lot of that is around kind of the logistical things. I know people point to, oh, it's politics or this or that. And I think that has less to do with the decline, but I think it has everything to do with the growth. And again, I realize, I know there's going to be some people here who they're like, it sounds like you're fence sitting. It sounds like whatever. I'm trying to make a very nuanced point here, but it's a very important one, because when I see these arguments go out, people point to factors of the 90s and sales trends and everything else accurately, that conditions have changed or limiting the market. That's true. And if you're trying to argue that point by saying, well, too many politics in Marvel books, you're going to lose. You're on the wrong ground. You're playing with the wrong cards. It's you're fighting the wrong argument. It's like saying, you need oxygen to live, and somebody going, well, you also need water to live. It's true, you do need water to live, but you also need the oxygen. You can't just argue different points simultaneously. But on the other end, comics today, and this is my question to you, and this is the one to ask yourself: are comics today a mass market product? If your answer is no, well, then you kind of have your answer. And whether it's the art styles, whether it's the hiring practices, whether it's politics, whether it's too much word balloons, whether you've unleashed Bendis and his typewriter on comics, whatever it happens to be, uh, it's not a mass market product. A mass market product is typically very homogenized. I mean, and again, if you're an artist or creator or musician, you hear that and you probably cringe because you don't want your music to be compared to like pop music. You want to have more substance in that. But there's a reason why Imagine Dragons and Coldplay and Maroon 5 and bands like that sell tons and tons and tons of albums, of material, of songs. They do that because their music is very homogenized. It's very unoffensive in that regard. It's designed to be played in libraries and malls, and it's designed for the radio. That's how it's designed. Now, I can't stand Maroon 5. I can't stand it at all. But if I was a record executive, I would be trying to have at least a few bands like that because I want to appeal to as many people as possible because I want to make money. I mean, I'm a big fan of Faith No More. I would not bank my entire music strategy and revenue and everything else around Faith No More. That would be a disaster. You would lose your ass. And I think this is where comics are. So does the kind of the lean into some of the more social issues and politics and everything else, is that the reason for comics decline? I think comics decline was happening anyway, but I do think that's the reason why we aren't seeing growth, and we should be seeing growth. We should, entertainment properties and people trying to find things to do and the movies being out and everything else should mean that we're getting some really nice growth out of comics right now, and we're not. And to me, the reason why is the product that's being put out is designed for a limited audience. Anyway, that's my theory. Again, I'm sure there's going to be some people who viewed this entire thing as splitting hairs and he's saying all the same thing, but there really is there is a fundamental difference here. There is a very, again, nuanced position that I think helps at least people understand kind of what's going on and where. At least for me anyway. So let me know your thoughts. Agree, disagree, what you think about all this. If it makes sense, it doesn't make sense, where you want to argue. Let me know that in the comments below. And thanks for listening.